primary care, postgraduate education, and I do some occasional work in family medicine. My attitude to astrology is that this was the first inklings of man attempting to understand the world around him. So it's quite easy to look up into the night sky and see these fantastic heavenly bodies. And over the generations and over the centuries and millennia, they did obviously determine certain configurations of the stars and the planets. And it was, I suppose, an easy jump to believe that these heavenly bodies had an influence on human behaviour and natural disasters by simple, what appeared to be cause and effect, but of course there's no evidence of this. And it developed over the centuries, and over the millennia, into those esoteric people who, other than being kings and queens, were the religious shamans and leaders of societies who also had major influence in domination over various peoples in different nations. They even were able to influence, as I said, royalty and kings and queens. This held sway, as with other aspects of witchcraft and magic and shamanism, until the Renaissance started men inquiring into what really was happening in the world around us. Certainly with people like Da Vinci, the great figures, and other figures in Italy and in France. William Harvey in England, who developed and understood the circulation of the blood. So the era of inquiry and investigation, the scientific principle of observation, hypothesis, experimentation and proof started to happen then, before the age of reason, during the Enlightenment, which really triggered the great scientific revolution and should have, I think, cast astrology into the dim and distant past where it belongs. But in our modern age, people who are not scientifically literate, who still find it difficult to understand the world around them because they have no knowledge about it, turn to easy answers: religion, astrology, all other forms of quasi-scientific information that is given to them through newspapers and magazines, third age people who believe in certain mythologies and all other sorts of mysterious happenings. So I look upon it as being part of that whole complex of non-proven, no evidence-based mystery and magic that a lot of people are subject to.
Yeah, thank you. But are you against it in principle, or are you against what is supposed to represent the knowledge about it?
Of course, I've been against it. I dismiss it as much as I don't believe in fairies or Father Christmas. I am concerned that it can influence some people's lives, and people who are vulnerable, psychologically vulnerable, can be damaged, I think, by belief in astrology, as they can be damaged by belief in all other sorts of magic and mystery. Of course, when I talk about this, I'm talking about so-called Western developed society. But astrology is believed, of course, by millions of people in underdeveloped and non-developed countries. And again, that's extremely dangerous, where you may have, as you have by particularly example, springs from Sri Lanka, where the Prime Minister would not, I think certainly Mrs. Bandaranaike was like that, I think even her successors are like that. They will look at these stars and talk to astrologers before they make a political decision. And this has happened, I think, even with probably people recently in the White House, who may also have worries about this, particularly Nancy Reagan's influence, I think, on her husband. So it's potentially dangerous. It's maybe just a bit of fun for some people when they read their astrology, the stars cast in the back of their magazines, but it really should be confined to the dustbin of history.
Tell me, what about the connections with Judaism? Do you think that as a Jew you have more reasons to be against it, for some?
I haven't thought about it in that respect, other than it seems to me that Kabbalah seems to be linked with certain aspects of astrology. Kabbalah again was an attempt at a very seriously depressing time for Jews who again sought to find some relief from the oppression and the disaster that were falling upon them during the Middle Ages, and there was an attempt to climb out of that. And in that respect, astrology has always been used by various groups of people. I never looked upon it particularly as being a Jewish object to either deny or to celebrate. But certainly, I think you do find elements of this in all religions. And I'm not that aware that even traditional Jewish groups, religious groups, utilize astrology in the public domain. I'm not quite sure about that.
So I'm going to pass to another subject, maybe connected, is you know that astrology has sometimes been used to understand history of, with cycles, with any sort of processes. And how would you understand the history of the Jews? You think there is any sort of cycle, any sort of law which imposes a certain rhythm to the history of the Jews or to the life of the Jews?
Well, it depends what you mean by the Jews, doesn't it? When did the Jews first make their appearance on the stage? When you read the ancient texts, we're not talking about the Jews, you're talking about tribes.
The Hebrews.
The Hebrews, the Hebraic tribes, the formation of what we know as Jews, even in the Bible. The Torah is not necessarily correct. But I do not believe in somehow naturally based cycles other than perhaps sunspots and other astronomical events, but certainly not in human history. And the whole aspect of astrology is that we're talking about planets set against the background of the stars, millions of miles away, light years away,
sure.
Which, if they had any quasi-scientific influence, say like a form of gravity, you would have more influence living 100 yards closer to the Eiffel Tower or to the Royal Albert Hall than to be influenced by the planet Mars, for example. So I don't believe this has any...
As a doctor, you know that, I do not know that the astrology was very important until the 17th century in the medical science, and many Jewish doctors were very important in the Middle Ages, and they were not totally strange to astrology, because it was part of their knowledge. For instance, astrology afforded a doctor to determine how long will the person stay in bed, or the computer.
But when we talk about early medicine,
prognostics,
early diet, early scientists as such, it was part of their whole world. With alchemy and astrology went hand in hand, and there was very little evidence base for much of this. I find it an amusing, as I said, aspect of human development, but I also do find it potentially quite worrying at times. The whole, and particularly at this period in history where there's a large anti-scientific movement which is being promoted, A, by the ignorant generally, and B, by the more aggressive fundamentalist religious groups, particularly from the United States, creationists, Christian groups in particular, other groups. Obviously Islam is also part of that. They also, traditional Islam, as in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, who do not regard any scientific understanding of the world as being the word of the Lord, so it can't necessarily be valid.
But for instance, well, let's take the cycle of the elections in England or anywhere else. You know, we have some, every 4 years, for instance, people are supposed to meet and to vote and elect. It's a sort of cycle, you see. I know it's nothing to do with astrology, but it seems that people feel as some sort of natural process that every 4 years there should be some new elections or some new voting, or there's some sort of cycle here, political, like there are also cycles in economics.
But it's a group of people sitting around a table deciding this at some time in history. It's a part of human behaviour to decide how their society develops. We may have a 4-year cycle. In some parts of the world, presidents are elected for life, or decide to take power for life. So it's so much to do with the whim of those in power.
But people who advocate democracy, as they say, or parliamentarism, they precisely advocate a certain form of cycle, which appear as being the best political system
Cyclical events are generally believed to be fair, that you give other people a chance after those in power or in office have given a chance to do something according to their manifestos. I don't think it has any other connection, for example, to our own biorhythms and other biological systems that appear to be cyclical.
Although sometimes psychologists say about the duration of a marriage or things like that there are some crises after a certain time.
Well, you do need psychologists. I mean, traditionally, people used to talk about the 7-year itch.
Like, for instance, yes.
The problem is that when people observe things and look at things anecdotally, it's very difficult to tell whether there's any real evidence. When you start trying to approach it in a scientific way of collating evidence and seeing what happens, you usually find there is no evidence for this type of thing. And as with a belief in, as with God figures, which I believe are created by man rather than the other way around, any of these cyclical events which appear somehow to be innate in our nature or in Mother Earth, Gaia, whatever system you want to call it, I don't really believe this is so, other than, as I said, natural events that can happen.
But don't you think, for instance, that to achieve something, for instance, why do they elect people for a certain time? Because they feel that someone would not be able to develop his policy in a too short period, for instance, that they need time for certain things. You need a certain time to arrive to some result.
Sure, and for whatever reason, most democratic countries have decided on a 4-year cycle. Sometimes it goes up to 5 years in Britain. It's not exactly.
Oh, it can arrive. In France, it's every 5 years. Or it was 7 years before.
But this was to stop oligarchies arriving and staying in power, and to stop dictatorships and totalitarian.
Yes, it has also have this role, but it's also because people need time to proceed in what they have in their program.
Indeed. But we must remember that a lot of the world is not democratic, and there are many intellectuals now who are tempted to dig away at the basic foundation of democracy and say, well, it's not the only system of government that can produce the goods. So.
And what about economics? Don't you think there are some laws connected with a certain time?
Well, so they say, but you see, the most vilified profession in the world, and today is a great example, are economists. They're always right and they're always wrong. At the moment, they're so quiet about the impending recession that's happening in the Western world. Where are they? They've got their heads below the parapet because they never told anybody this was going to happen. Where were their predictions? They didn't give warnings about the greed of banks and financial institutions which were lending money to people without any guarantees of return. So I think economists certainly tend to have a very poor situation amongst most people. They always write books about cycles, but they all write different ones about different cyclical events. There's now the new nudge economics, apparently, which the British Tory party is interested in, this American writer who talks about behavioural aspects of economics, which is moving away from these more quasi-scientific concepts of cyclical events in economics. If they're so cyclical, then why bother to do anything? They're either going to happen naturally or not. So economics is a mess, and nobody seems to be predictive. The only predictive economics were when you had a controlled economy, a centralized economy, as in the Soviet Union.
Big plans.
They were disasters, the planned economies.
Yes. And, well, anyway, in the Jewish life, there is the Orthodox life of Jews, there are certain type of cycles.
Sure.
In the Bible, there are some laws connected with the cycle. Even the Shabbos is a cycle.
Sure.
Do you think it's good that we should have weekends, for instance?
Yes, I think the great contribution of Judaism in that respect was to have a day of rest. And it's supposed to be for everybody, including your servant and the lowest worker in the society. Whether or not this actually ever occurred in ancient times amongst Jewish families, I'm not sure.
Oh.
But certainly that concept that you can have a rest, the concept of a holiday, a vacation, were breakthroughs, were great innovations.
Good.
and we need this. Society needs it as well as individuals in order to survive. And so, religion has always had a fundamental influence on social aspects and social development in humanity. But that doesn't mean it had some kind of divine inspiration for this to happen.
As a doctor, you're perfectly aware of all the process of giving birth to a child, and that it takes a certain time, and there are certain stages. I mean, it's a very strong example of something which is programmed for a certain period, and there is a time for this, a time for that, a beginning, an end, etc.
Biological systems, by their very nature, will come to life and they die in some form or another. That's what happens in biological systems. In other ways, they are immortal because DNA is passed on to the next generation. So it depends how you look at it. The actual physical, biological outer structures of plants and animals of any kind may disappear. The DNA carries on, and in that respect you're immortal. So it's a continuum in that respect rather than a cycle. The cycle is only to do with the complex creatures that develop during a very short span that they are on planet Earth, which appears at the moment to be the only planet that sustains life.
Well, at least you won't deny totally the influence of the moon, for instance.
The moon has an influence principally because of gravitational pull. There is also some evidence on effects on ions, positive or negative ions in the atmosphere, which can influence people, certainly psychologically, possibly physically. They tend to say, which is now not necessarily taken as absolute truth, that the menstrual cycle can be influenced by lunar changes. I'm not quite sure that now is really true. But there are so many other things that can influence us, other than something 250,000 miles away, which the moon is, of course.
It seems that certain plants or certain animals have connected themselves with certain cosmic cycles.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean. But
fishes are mussels.
Well, I'm sure there are. Whatever happens, whatever animal the animal kingdom relates to, which we are unaware of, it is nevertheless due to something or other, something of a basic molecular structure which affects their biological system. It doesn't happen by some vague ether or some vague influence, some force that we don't know about. Biological systems are affected by very real particles, whatever those particles may be, whether they're subatomic or molecular. And certainly and electromagnetic fields as well. We are bombarded all the time on planet Earth by many of these influences. And certainly sunspot activity can have a major influence on weather and possibly even biological systems.
To return to the zodiac and the horoscopes, and it corresponds to a certain need. How would you explain the fact that people are ready to identify themselves with one sign of zodiac? And
well, it makes the world easier for them to live in, an understanding. People always look for the quick answer, the easy answer. It happens today in modern society. Why people the youngsters are influenced very much by cults and other organisations that give them a quick fix, an easy answer. And to think that you're part of a certain, as you say, star sign, with certain characteristics, it's variable. Look at China, has a whole different concept.
That's right, yes.
In their systems.
Yeah.
So it's obviously not immutable, and it's not necessarily absolute if different civilizations come up with different answers.
That's right. Okay, thank you very much. It was not scheduled, but it's part of our program.
How was that?
Well, I think you have a certain...
Or is it vision as well?
Yes, it's vision as well.
I should have put my makeup.
You are photogenic, I don't know.
You reckon?
But yes, actually, prophetism is part of Judaism, and the word prophets for everybody means someone who is able to perceive the future. And so, as a Jew, we have a sort of heritage, of prophetical heritage, And do you deny this heritage, or do you think that some people are really, some leaders are really apt to prophetize or something? Or
there's an old saying, knowledge is power. And any prophet, any leader of a religious group, any shaman or witch doctor had certain knowledge that most other people tended not to have. And if you have this knowledge that others do not have, you can predict possible occurrences. As a doctor, as a scientist, you have certain evidence, and I can, when I look at the evidence, when I examine somebody and look at their laboratory test results, I can give a reasonable prediction of what might happen to them based on information. And I'm sure, and this has happened time and time again, when in society, small or large, some have more knowledge than others, they can be looked upon as prophets.
yes.
But prophets can also be wrong.
I would like to come back to problems of science, epistemology, etc. You know that in many cases, well, in social life, political life, or in religious life, people, what is to prove? Can you tell us what do you mean by proof when you say something hasn't been proven, I think you say. What is the protocol? What is the method to prove something, to pass from the theory to apply? I mean, this is a problem of what applied sciences and.
Well, it's to do with evidence, and certainly the major change in the past couple of decades, certainly in Britain, and I'm sure it's the same in France and the rest of Europe, the United States, is what we call evidence-based medicine. Because it was seen that much of what we did, which we thought had a basis in truth, didn't. It was often based on anecdote, personal experience, or a very small number of cases that one did and extrapolated that this is a cure or this is a way of doing things. But now we're looking much more rigorously at how evidence is collated. And this has been a huge change in medical treatments and medical methodology. So evidence is the basis of everything. Nothing obviously in the world is absolute, but you can be as near absolute as you can be by being rigorous in your scientific investigation.
But don't you think, for instance, that many systems do work if you try seriously to apply them? You know, it's which would make things more relative. I mean, once something suits a group of people and they are going to give a chance to it and they're going to follow it, it will have a minimum appliance. It will work because we use it.
It's the old saying that, you know, if it works, why break it? The more you look at alternative and complementary medicine, for example, there are things we don't fully understand, that things may work. But the more these are investigated, the more you find that there is very little evidence that things do work. See, anecdotal evidence is largely the basis of establishing proof for many non-scientific methods. Anecdotal evidence is not good enough. You need to be as objective as possible. And objectivity tends to rule out statistical nonsense.
For instance, doctors have applied certain knowledge which seems retrospectively very doubtful, but they worked with that and they were helping with that in any way.
To some extent, but you see, this is the problem now with evidence-based medicine. They've examined lots of, as you say, methods that were used and was thought to be due to a good foundation of knowledge. But when they were investigated, they found that A, there was not any considerable body of knowledge behind them, and B, the evidence that these things had positive outcomes is not there, because not enough random controlled trials were done. There's now things called meta-analysis, whereby lots of trials are looked at together and not just individual ones, to see whether things actually have the outcomes that they claim to have.
Do you think that we should make more... you think maybe the problem is also that we we are reluctant to make experiments about human people. And by refusing to make experiments, then what you call the science of man are late compared with the exact sciences or the technical sciences, because precisely we don't try enough different schemes.
Well, we do actually. There are lots of volunteers involved in medical treatments and in medical investigations, but there are also other models that are used, particularly, and this is where the anti-vivisectionists jump up with that, we use animals for much of the experimentation.
Yeah, all right, yes.
Which may not always be exactly correlated to human biological systems, but they are very often very significant. But other methods of investigation, experimentation are being developed, some at biochemical levels.
But in the field of social life, for instance, because let's take an example of astrology. Astrology is something which has to do with social life, with psychology, with sociology, with politics, with religion. Mm-hmm. So in this field, why people accept a certain model? Why do they say, well, let's just live according to those rules? It's not because it has been proven. It's because they are attracted, they're fascinated by a certain quality of the system, of the aesthetical feeling, actually.
There are aesthetic aspects of this, but generally, unlike science, which tends to be an add-on speciality, that they will find new knowledge and improve things. They will also reject knowledge that they realise was not as good evidence base as they thought. And if in science you get better information, you will change your mind. Whereas in many of the other areas you're talking about, including sociology and psychology, there's fad. There are so many different schools. Which one is right?
So, for instance, let's take the example of Israel. Is Zionism has Zionism been proven true, if it's possible to say that, or it's just because it has been accepted and then it has necessarily a certain form of truth and reality by itself?
Proven to whose statement? Proven if the purpose of Zionism was the national liberation of the Jewish people, which was at a certain place and time, after centuries, millennia of persecution and oppression, and then the culmination of what appeared to be no future for Jews, particularly in Eastern Europe, Zionism developed like any other national liberation organisation. And if that was to establish a Jewish state where Jews could be responsible for their own destinies, then it has proven it. It depends how you define Zionism. Religious Zionism, right-wing Zionism, left-wing Zionism, take your pick. But certainly a nation-state run by Jews, principally for Jews, who can determine what will happen to themselves, that exists. We may be, as some say, in a post-Zionist situation now. And if you are a Zionist, the definition of a Zionist outside Israel is a Jew who tells somebody else to go and live in Israel. So, if you are a Zionist, go to Israel.
Yeah, but do you think that we could consider other Jewish experiments?
Well, there were other Jewish experiments. I think the Bund was a Jewish experiment. The Bund was, as you know, a major Jewish socialist, had a huge influence in the Pale of Settlement and in Poland, and at its height had possibly 1 million or more adherents to it. It led its own life. It believed in Jewish autonomy within the states that they lived in. They did not accept the concept of Zionism, of going to another state. They thought they could achieve Jewish autonomy where they were based. But of course, incidents proved them wrong. The Holocaust, Soviet communism demonstrated that the Bund's vision failed.
But to know that it failed, you have to try, all right?
Well, they didn't know what was going to happen.
Yes. So in fact, to prove something, this is what I wanted to say. To prove something, you have to try for a certain time to see what happens.
Of course.
You cannot know from the beginning that it's not going to work, or can you?
I only certain things in life, like as I said, certainly certain scientific experiments. They knew they were going to develop. They wanted to develop an atom bomb. They knew it was going to work. What they didn't know what the consequences might be, and the dropping of the atom bomb was a political decision and not a scientific one. But they knew what they were doing to develop it. But other movements to do with human beings and society and politics and even wars, you can't predict the outcomes.
No. So does that prevent us to do something? Or to try something?
Because that's the human condition.
I think human people have to accept their failure, but they have to try.
That's the human condition, is to try. Because otherwise you get to the point, what is the purpose of life? Sit on your tuchus and just look around you because you know it's pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Because once human beings developed sentience, they knew they were going to die. The concept that we are the only known animals who know we are going to die, have a limited lifespan, promoted, in my opinion, many aspects of human behaviour. Determined to make something of life, determined to be altruistic, determined to help others, determined to defend your family, your clan, your tribe, your nation.
Well, for instance, I don't know if you have been interested by prehistory or by Darwinism or etc., but a lot of things we do belong to a very old determinism, which has been determined by very old civilizations, and
Sure.
And do you think that certain things might have been transmitted from generation to generation,
Well,
not only through culture but through genetics, for instance?
I don't believe there is such a thing as that human social behaviour is passed on genetically. I do not believe that.
There's a debate about that, yes.
Well, evolutionary psychologists go on about this a lot, but it's mostly theoretical. It's a hypothesis which they can find very difficult to prove.
For instance, the Jews. How can you explain the Jewish phenomenon? Is it why is it so old? Do you think it's just depending on a certain culture that the individual received when they were born, or is there something more deeply rooted?
You're saying why are we still here?
Yes.
Well, basically, one can say why we're still here was because uniquely there was a group of people who were persecuted throughout known history. Persecution, as long as you're not completely wiped out, can be a great stimulus for survival. And maybe the concepts of ancient Jews with the Torah, the concepts of a single God, a rest day for all, other moral attitudes that you find in the early writings were quite so unique at the time that they caused anger, resentment by the big civilization that they found themselves in. We seem to forget that the Jews at any one time were a tiny state, a tiny group of people who sometimes didn't even mention a paragraph in history. But certainly they were dangerous enough in their beliefs and attitudes that caused empires like the Romans and the Greeks particularly to try to stamp them out.
So, secular Judaism, for instance, which isn't it just precisely a tendency to believe that Judaism exists beyond any practice?
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? What is secular Judaism? To do that, we must first of all state that Judaism, or being Jewish, is not solely a religion. You can't be, although I read in the newspaper a Muslim described herself as a secular Muslim. That's a nonsense. You can't be a secular Christian. You can be a secular Jew,
yes,
which indicates that we are more than a religious grouping.
Yes.
And there is evidence that we have some ethnicity, even though it's principally in two major groups, Sephardim and Ashkenazi. But certainly it is just self-indulgence to believe that if you're a secular Jew living in the diaspora, you can actually have a continuum of your Jewishness. And that's the whole problem. I feel the reason most of us want to be here as secular Jews is to feel that our Jewishness, from our connections with our parents and grandparents and what we know of the past, we want it to continue in future generations. But the more secular we are, the more we accept other people around us as being of equal stature and deserving of being the same as Jews, that we're not a special group, we're not a privileged people, we're not a chosen people, we know that the chances are our children, our children's children, will move away from any aspect of being Jewish.
Yeah, so you don't. There's this connection between culture and nature, or not. How do you say nurture and nature? That you say in English.
Well, it's always been the big debate: nature and nurture. What is most influence? Certainly, I can only look at it personally. I know some people who cling to the memory of the blood, but it's a nostalgic backwater, a nostalgic dead end. The only in large Jewish communities, as in the United States in particular, and in New York even more so, you can be a secular Jew, at least for the next century.
Don't you think that, for instance, the Jews, by having their specific laws, their specific ways of eating, their specific habits, might have created a specific determinism and a specific heredity?
I'm sure they did, because it was quite unique, as far as I know. I'm not an expert on this. Amongst other religions, pagan religions, as Jews would call them, it was very unique in what they did. And how it came about is difficult to know, but it certainly did. But throughout history, even in other ancient civilizations, there were always thinkers and philosophers who looked at life in a different way to the mainstream.
So, to return to astrology, maybe we could say that if our ancestors, not only Jews but mankind in general, or certain groups of people, have believed in the stars and have acted according to the stars, maybe some sort of attitude or sensitivity or receptivity to certain signals coming from the stars might have been transmitted.
Transmitted where?
In our system of perception or reception of to reaction to signals. Maybe we have been conditioned to react to certain signals, and this conditionment might have been transmitted in a way or another, even if the stars do not have any influence. But if you react to a certain signal because it is visual, and you cannot contest that you can see stars, and you can see planets, and you can see conjunctions, and you can see certain signals. It doesn't matter if these signals have an energetic power or not, but at least we cannot deny that there can be signals which may be identified and detected by our consciousness or subconsciousness.
Our consciousness and our subconsciousness certainly is affected by what we see. We look at a beautiful sunset and we feel something wonderful about it. But that's a big leap from there to say that has an effect on what's going to happen to me. And if that was the case, if it was so basic, if it was so much part of the human condition, why did scientists come about? Why was the first man to stand up and question things? If it was so immutable, that this feeling that our behaviour was determined by certain signals and reception and behaviour, why was it changed? Why have we got the great scientific revolution that happened?
I don't see the contradiction. I am sorry to.
Could
you develop your point? I don't see exactly the contradiction or the challenge
because
here.
If it was so much so that, as you're saying, that we behave in a certain way because we observe certain patterns of stars and the effect of astrology, one would have thought this would have been so powerful that society would have, even today, still be basing our whole structure on astrology.
Well, this to answer to this argument, there are many things which have become subconscious. Our society may perfectly be unconscious of certain processes. Doesn't mean these processes do not exist and do not play a certain role.
The problem is, you go back to the fact that astrology was nevertheless a man-made development.
Yes.
And if it's man-made development, like so many other things, it doesn't mean that it's somehow... I understand where you're going, I think, that it's somehow embodied within us, almost genetically, if not quite so. But I don't believe that happens. In the same way that Darwin refuted Lamarckism.
Yes, this is a point.
And we know Lamarckism does not occur.
That's right. There is a problem with... there is a very essential epistemological problem in the fact that until now we are not exactly able to accept the idea of any culture becoming nature, in sort of way. Any cultural attitudes, any cultural convention which pass to a certain level of unconsciousness, subconsciousness, and hereditary heritage. But it doesn't mean that it won't be discovered one day or the other. There is a problem here.
There's lots of things that are yet to be discovered, but certainly the way modern science is going, the way it's understanding DNA, the way we understand genes and how they're made up, and the debate still, as you said earlier on, between nature and nurture, and we know both have an effect. Because you find a gene that may be responsible for a certain disease, it doesn't mean it's going to happen, because there are certain other influences, behavioural influences, outside influences, lifestyle influences, which have to work as well as that gene being in place. But something as vague or esoteric as other type of influences, I don't really feel that this is going to be determined, going to be found.
Well, Darwinism has certain weak points, because, for instance, even if we refuse that that might be a sort of transmission, anyway, mankind has evolved, and we are the heirs of a rather evolved mankind, which means there are some progresses which have been maintained throughout the ages, and which did not exist at the beginning of what we could call a sort of pre-human structure.
Sure.
So something has been maintained, which was, and we are not very clear about, well, the fact that certain progresses, man has progressed genetically, anatomically, and that these progresses have been maintained and transmitted. There is anyway, and why has there been any progress? Because some men have done certain things, have lived under different conditions, which were better for the improvement of the species, etc. I mean, we cannot deny totally that Darwinism is totally disconnected from any cultural system.
I don't think Darwinism claims it does, but Darwinism is a biological theory. It's to do with natural selection.
Natural selection is not totally. Natural selection is connected to the fact that certain way of life has been more productive, has made a mankind more effective. I mean, it was result from certain habits.
I wouldn't say it was a result of certain habits. It was more the effect of the environment where people found themselves living. And in some parts of the world, human beings were unable to live and develop society. If you look at how civilizations developed, it's pretty obvious. They developed in delta regions. They developed where there was water and food available for them to develop. There are the theories of certain climatic bands across the world where people developed and why civilizations developed where they were. You may have people living in the North Pole, but it's such a tenuous and hard existence. They hardly developed. In certain other parts of the world, development was delayed by the environment they lived in.
Yes.
Human beings could survive, but not very well sometimes.
But sometimes, okay, so once you say there is an importance of the environment, okay, there is also the capacity of a certain group of people to use the environment properly or not.
They use it to survive, but in harsh, extreme conditions, I don't know anywhere that I can think of where great developments in human civilization were made.
Yes, but still, well, for instance, so you consider, it's interesting because what you said about Judaism is more or less of the same sort. You say it is persecution which has made the Jews. The Jews have not decided by themselves to be different. It is the nature, the conditions of life which have made mankind to become so and so.
Well, it's a simplistic statement I made that it's persecution. It wasn't just persecution, because certainly at certain times in history, Jews were utilised by nation states they were in. They could have a privileged position at times. It was, you could say, almost a toss of a coin that the Roman Empire could have become Jewish rather than Christian. And certainly other not great nations, but large nations like the Khazar kingdoms, for a short while, were ostensibly Jewish. They chose to be Jewish. And it died out because of lots of other influences. So I think it's not just a question of persecution, but it certainly helped.
Yes, But the fact that Jews gave to themselves some laws, some interdictions, some prohibitions, it's not necessarily connected with any sort of persecution. Maybe it had been the cause of persecution in many ways, than the result of persecution.
Well, you read reading about the stiff-necked Jews, the Jews who won't bow down, they won't worship our gods. Who are these people? They call themselves the chosen people. Obviously, that will cause resentment. But you are also forgetting that there were massive movements, certainly after the great empires fell, where despite their organisation, Jews were nevertheless tolerated within the Roman world and tolerated within the Greek world, as long as they didn't make too much of a fuss. But when Christianity came about, Christianity, which spread so rapidly, that was a major factor, not only in persecution of the Jews, but in actually maintaining Jews, because Jews had to be kept as a witness. The Christian church could have eradicated most Jewish communities easily by the sword. They did it in many places, but not in a mass way when you think about it. But if they destroyed every Jew in Europe, where were the witnesses to Christ's crucifixion?